Welcome to the Play Typer Guy podcast. I'm Stephen Robinson. Joining me today are Evan Stern and Stuart Beckham from the Stew on This podcast. Guys, thanks for joining me.
And thank you for having Evan and I. And Evan also authors Certain Thoughts, which is a great Substack.
I would hope that you could kind of tell us about the podcast and your Substacks, what you guys do, and then we can start the conversation. But from there.
Yeah, Certain Thoughts on politics and culture, past, present, and future. So I write a little bit of everything. I do some live stuff with Stu. So a lot of the stuff that we create for content on Substack also pushes into podcast format, which is really cool. But primarily my writing and the video work that we do lives on the Substack platform.
Yeah, piggybacking on that, I have been working with Evan for a few months now. Stew on This started as Under the Sun, and then I rebranded last year to become Stew on This. And what the objective is to blend historical thinking and current events analysis and try to debunk some of the instincts for us to think that what's happening today is new or an aberration or just a completely unseen development that can't be connected to through lines from the past. And I met Evan through our Substack writing, and we currently do a podcast called Reality Checking the Bulwark, which is us just using that analysis that both Evan and I bring to the table in that particular blend of analysis to observe one of Substack's most popular publications, which is the Bulwark, and how it is informing and changing the conversation around democratic politics and the larger democracy movement within America.
And that was a great segue into this because, and I've made this point as well in my own Substack and own writings of how the Bulwark in particular and other sort of Never Trump publications. And I think we even saw this in January 6th and how that was presented specifically by Liz Cheney and others, which is to present Trump as an outlier, that this party, and for many reasons, you guys can get into this, Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden said the same thing, that the Republican Party was a good faith actor, sort of like, Alan Alda on The West Wing, and it was all going in this direction. And suddenly Trump came along and it shifted, it changed. And that is not, necessarily true. And there's often a lot of pushback. I've seen this from Tom Nichols in particular, who doesn't write for the Bulwark, but he's a Never Trumper who really resists any sort of particular criticism of Reagan, or even attempts to draw a straight line from Reagan to Trump, and then within Democrats enabling it with you have Elise Slotkin saying that Reagan would be rolling in his grave by bad domestic policies, which is just so absurd considering he blew up the economy. But like things that Democrats should be talking about, they aren't, and it's gotten worse, I would think, because of that sort of connection. So let me ask you guys, because a lot of what occurred at the Bulwark, how the Bulwark sort of shifted into the center right and the center left rather, and it's sort of informing the conversation, to me seemed inevitable. Like they were going to sort of, Chuck Schumer famously had said that, we're losing working class voters, especially without college and so forth. But for every one of them, we'll gain 2 suburban college educated white voters. And that was sort of occurring. And then, the Tea Party was sort of pushing out kind of these folks. And then it kind of exploded. And with Trump, and now sort of these folks are saying we're not only just part of the party now, we're going to determine the best direction of the party. So that was a long segue up to sort of what you guys think about this.
I have some thoughts, but Stu, why don't you answer first?
Okay, yeah, certainly. I have been following the, Never Trump conservatives or Republicans for almost a decade now. I'm a zillennial, so I was in college in the 2010s. I studied history, and specifically, I studied the Cold War, communications throughout the Cold War, and how the idea of America in the 1950s and the media at that time translated into the cultural products into the rest of the 20th century. And part of that basically opened me up to studying the new right and the rise of Nixon's Southern strategy, and the rise of Reaganism. And I I remember I was surprised when Trump first became president. But the thing that I really became obsessed with or really interested in was how the Chamber of Commerce or the National Security Wing of the large, like three-legged or four-legged stool of modern conservatism reacted to Trump's rise, because you had someone who was using all saying the quiet part out loud and using all of the social animus and aggressive political rhetoric that usually is held to the campaign, but doing it at a national level and not even doing it with any kind of plausible deniability. So that's how I came across the Bulwark. First the Weekly Standard, and then the Bulwark, and that's kind of how I have been immersed into this longer argument, and it continued as I studied political communications at American University. This longer argument about what conservatism is. Is it Trumpism? Is Trumpism the death of conservatism? Is it a break from conservatism? Or is this just the natural endpoint of conservatism that everybody either wanted to avoid or couldn't imagine it becoming this way? And that has informed a lot of my writing, a lot of the knowledge products I've put out on my Substack or throughout social media or in general in podcasting with Evan. And that is why we did Reality Checking the Bulwark, because at this point, the Bulwark has grown from just being a niche conservative publication where you have a bunch of conservative exiles essentially debating over whether Trump is true conservatism, what they missed or what they couldn't see when they were supporting conservative campaigns or reiterating conservative talking points on TV, which they still kind of do. And it has grown into one of kind of the integral narrative forces within the larger Democratic Party machinery and the pro-democracy movement, representing this kind of mythical middle voter or this reformed Republican or ex-Republican that wants to vote for Democrats, but gets a little bit too scared by the Starbucks barista talking about trans rights and talking about Black Lives Matters. And so they kind of have fashioned themselves as kind of the Sherpa or the suburban Republican whisperer. And that is their essential place within the larger Democratic Party's ability to message to America. And that's why Evan and I decided after 2024 and all of the litigation over who lost 2024, who's to blame, or what was the reason 2024 was lost, we realized that a lot of the Bulwark's products were not really being interrogated or not getting as much of a close eye as a lot of other products were getting. And so we decided we wanted to kind of talk about some of the things we think they got right, but a lot of the things we think they got wrong, and how that became a narrative force essentially for whenever they platform moderate Democrats or support Alyssa Slotkin or essentially advise Democrats to take a more conservative or neoconservative lane when it comes to messaging politics.
Yeah, well, I think you identified it perfectly. The inevitability with which the mission creep for the Bulwark would expand, the inevitability with which the audience for the Bulwark would grow beyond never Trump conservatives to sort of moderates and centrists and even left-wing Democrats like myself. It goes back to Clinton, I think. It goes back to the triangulation strategy that the Democrats have been doing now for the better part of 30 years. But what we see over the course of time, from Clinton to Kerry to Obama to the failure of Hillary Clinton, that this triangulation strategy to try and pull voters from the right, it has diminishing returns. And that over the course of time, the electoral gains from pushing that approach get smaller and smaller. Mm-hmm. But while that has while the value of that from the electoral outcomes becomes limited, that triangulation strategy still serves an interest group that doesn't care whether Democrats actually win, whether that's
Sure.
right, your entrenched corporate interests or the foreign policy establishment and the elites and all the status quo interest. So because it doesn't actually serve the Democratic Party anymore, but because it serves these entrenched interests, there has to be a new way to continue to sell that, I think.
Mhm.
And what you have with the Bulwark is a novelty within the Democratic Party. With the Bulwark moving left and this inevitable growth of its subscriber base and becoming an outlet of influence on the left and within the pro-democracy coalition, it's these new novel voices that the Democratic establishment, that is a right-wing establishment, can use to validate their worldview and say, even these people agree. Look at all these people. They represent the political opportunity for us, when in reality, that actual constituency is negligible.
Oh, very small. It has not won. I mean, the Bulwark has done very well for itself. It's been a great home for people who would not have been able to find work in a MAGA world. They'd been either pushed out or had to debase themselves, and I can respect not wanting to do, the latter. But 2016, 2024, 2020, we can argue is less about the Bulwark or less about Never Trumpers and more about a global pandemic. And we still lost House seats, and Trump came very, very close to winning. I do want to go back to when you talk about Clinton. I'm going to incredibly date myself. He was the first person I ever voted for in 1992 when I was
Amazing.
18. And he, while doing the triangulation strategy, was someone who, growing up in the South and growing up in working class environments, had an appeal to working class people. And we can debate why that was or what that was, but that was something that Democrats have been slowly losing over time. And when, to the extent that there are a lot of Clinton voters, working class, non-college Clinton voters, who the Bulwark does not represent. The Bulwark might even have sort of condescension toward. And whenever people talk about how do we get these groups back into the party, or particularly young men, I mean, there's all debates about the Rogans or Hassan Piker, and we can get into that. But to me, when there was the debate about Piker, or if there was room for Piker in the party, and look, we're a diverse group here. There's Broadway theater posters behind me. Look, I'm not as normality, right? But it was Tim Miller and Sarah Longwell, two, urban, college-educated queer people debating essentially the part. Like it was this weird, but presenting as if we are speaking for what normal people in the world are, and it was like, really? Like, are you? Do you have any more insight than I do? As really? But I think there's a lot of people who believe this, right? Who believe that they offer some insight that they perhaps don't.
It collides with, remember, during the first term, there was this large debate over what energized Trumpism. And you had a lot of civil rights scholars and a lot of people who studied America from the angle of race and identity, talking about it from the idea that it was a racial backlash to the election of the first Black president. And then you have at the same time people who are also part of that school of critical theory, who study gender dynamics and different bigotries spanning from religion to sexuality, also saying that this is a backlash towards just multiculturalism, multiracialism altogether. And there was, on the counter to that debate, a lot of people who made the argument that no, because what that does is that casts a lot of Americans in this like reputably negative space where they are just empowered by their prejudices or bigotries, and really they are just angry about the post 2008 crisis economic landscape, which is also a valid thing to be angry about, and there's a lot of data to support that as well. And so there was this push and pull between what Trumpism represented. Was it an anti-establishment, anti-elite movement, or was it a um, a racial, gender, sexual, religious backlash, all steeped in the idea of America as a haven for particularly white male Christian conservatism?
Sure.
And so I think what happened is that the Democrats don't want to jump onto either message, because monopolizing on one message could hurt the coalition who doesn't want to believe that. So if you want to believe the racial backlash, then you might hurt the kind of Josh Gottheimer free trade, free commerce, donor back part of the party. But if you only do the anti-establishment messaging without referencing the appeals to naked racism and naked misogyny, then you might harm the NAACP, the Planned Parenthood, the kind of rights-backed part of the coalition. So they saw the Bulwark as somebody who could message towards the Reagan Democrats, the white working class voters, who kind of left the party in a very intricate, but in a snowball effect throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s. After the Civil Rights Act was signed, and LBJ famously said, we'll never get the Southern vote again. They kind of saw them again as the people to talk to that group of voters, the white working class, who not necessarily is racist or is sexist, but at the same time is just culturally uncomfortable with the way that cosmopolitan hubs within the American continent are changing outside of the way that they're used to. And all of that is based on a bargain that the Bulwark types, or the people who used to be Republicans, who built the narrative structure behind Republican politics, are able to win those voters for Democrats, because Trump's abuses or Trump's policy failures would hurt them so much that they would have no choice but to vote for Democrats. And we kind of still see that playing out today, where if you watch Bulwark content or watch their analysis, they're claiming that this is going to be the magic bullet that ends Trumpism because the economy is going to flip, or because the Epstein revelations are going to just be so nakedly disgusting. And after, I hate to say it, after, for me, 9 years of waiting for a magic bullet, you start to wonder if that's really the narrative, or if there is just a fundamental misreading of the coalition, a coalition that at its backbone has always been younger people, progressives, Black women, rights organizers, and not really relying on the people who vote for Republicans whenever a Democrat doesn't sufficiently triangulate or have a Sister Soldier moment where he has to down somebody speaking clearly about civil rights or power dynamics within America, and that makes them more comfortable for voting for that candidate. And I think that is kind of where the Bulwark came in, because like you said, they're queer coded, they are younger, so they kind of come off as, hey, we're not like your dad Republicans, we're kind of like your neighbor who you hang out with or see a movie with, but is also secretly a Republican.
Sure.
And so we can talk to these people and bring them into the Democratic fold and build a large coalition based on our experiences working within the Republican Party.
Yeah, but it's a party that's sort of changed. I mean, there is this entire sort of anti-establishment thing. And again, Carter ran on anti-establishment. There's a corruption. I'm coming in. Bill Clinton did. Obama did to a certain degree. I mean, that's sort of true. And I guess, because I want to ask about like the sense of how they are trying to decide who is in the party. Because look, every coalitions should be including people who want to I want to make the party more center left. I want to make the party more left wing. And we have vigorous debate over that and then get behind which of us wins. I think, ironically, I think Tim Miller was more inclined to believe that's what we should be doing as a pro-democracy. What Sir Longwell, and I think Charlie Sykes and others have been doing more is saying, well, no, we need to remove the DSA coalition entirely and we can win. But the numbers aren't really there for that, which leads to a lot of what I call Schrodinger's leftists, because, everything I've heard has been, since I was, again, in my mid-20s when Gore lost, everything there was like, this was Nader's fault. and then later, and again in 2000, then when these people they voted third party, they wasted their vote, which is fine. But I think there was a period where it's like, well, yeah, if Susan Sarandon, Cornel West, even Jill Stein in 2016 had been like, yeah, here's the things I disagree with on Hillary Clinton, but my God, Trump's terrible. I'm going to campaign. They'd been fine with that. And that to me is what I would have advocated for. But now it's like, okay, well, if you're saying that, not just me, Slotkin or Marilyn McMorrow, I don't want to like campaign with Hassan Piker, but my opponent shouldn't. It is disqualifying my opponent to be seen with him. And I'm going to say how bad this guy is. And then it's like, okay, well, you want his vote later? Like either these people are part of your coalition or not. And if they're part of your coalition, it's like we disagree and we'll have each other on and each other's shows, or we're part of the family. We disagree, but we're united. And if that's not the case, then it's like, okay, well, you need to figure out how to win. Never Trumpers, to me, have long reflected the idea of knowing how that stool worked. And Rick Wilson has spoken about this, and Stuart Stevens and others, which is, yeah, we knew that we had Marjorie Taylor Greene voters. We knew we had, and look, Romney accepted Trump's a birther's endorsement in 2012. The idea is like, we know these loons were there, but they voted for us, and we would go and we'd feed them some red meat. David Aframis said this: you go, you feed them some red meat, then you run to the center, and then you get elected, but you keep them happy. You don't beat up on those guys. It's just, you kind of do winking and nodding at them. I mean, Bob Dole at the 96 convention famously said to racists, I don't want your vote. The market are clearly marked. But I don't think, we're getting that for Democrats about the left yet, right? We're saying, we don't want your vote. We don't want your votes for young people. I mean, I've seen that from folks, but it's like, look, I don't think there's enough Sarah Longwells or Tim Millers to make up for those voters you want to chase away or not deal with. And there's a lot of, to me, sort of selective sense of who we can include in the tent or not.
Anybody who's gonna lead with this type of argument, and doesn't have to be mutually exclusive, but the question fundamentally is it arrogance or is it bigotry? Because you'll see somebody like, and I have no problem saying it, Mona Charen will make electoral arguments, political arguments that strike me as somebody who doesn't want to express their bigotry in public. And so they project a political concern, a risk, and says, because all of these voters that you want are bigoted, you shouldn't do this because the bigotry is going to hurt you. And she understands that it's not acceptable professionally, politically, for her to express that bigotry on her own behalf. But the analysis is doing a lot of work to launder that bigotry and give it credibility. Now, with the case of Miller and Longwell, sometimes I wonder, is it they have their own bigotry and they're laundering it consciously or subconsciously, or is it just arrogance? Is it just the belief that because in the case of Longwell, she takes the smear campaign about Hassan Piker hook, line, and sinker. She buys, regurgitates, and stands 10 toes down on the assertion that he is an anti-Semite. And that's the entire basis of her analysis that she shares with the rest of the world. Now, so the question is, just because she believes that, is it reliable to assume that a whole bunch of people are also going to believe that? Because the analysis is predicated on people will buy the smear campaign in such a broad degree that it will hurt Democrats politically. And I think this is where Tim Miller is trying to hold her and say, you may believe that, but it doesn't actually transfer onto the entire electorate that all these other people will believe that. He's willing to name the credibility gap. There's a paradox with the widely accepted analysis within the Bulwark that you spoke to, which is Trump's going to hurt the economy so badly that he's going to lose a lot of his voters and a lot of his supporters. But that analysis only seems to start having some credibility from their view now. When if you see a larger more widespread, more diverse set of voters as having economic concerns, and those economic concerns being really credible and motivating their choices, then this goes back a long time. And it seems like the Bulwark is only starting to incorporate that economic concern analysis now, which mirrors the same way they look at public opinion on Israel. They're only now starting to truly wrestle with and reconcile with the way that public opinion has shifted dramatically on Israel and what that means for political outcomes and what political actors should do in response to that. But that they're so late, they are so slow. So whether it's adapting to public opinion on foreign policy or economics in the way that people's bread and butter issues are affected by the choices of political actors, it sure seems like the Bulwark has a very narrow slice of who they think matters and whose concerns seem to trigger a change in their analysis. You're right that Miller and Longwell are queer, but they're also elites. I mean, these are wealthy people.
Sure.
And that's the thing that they have in common. And they don't seem to have any awareness of people who are really struggling and have long been struggling. And they're super late to that. So is it arrogance? Is it laundered bigotry? Is it some combination of the two?
And, and I'm not meaning to cast aspersions on queerness, obviously, or anything like that. It just struck out to me of, if you're just talking just general like demographics, right? Like these two people speaking about Hassan Piker or about even the attempt to reach young men who aren't particularly like those voters, they're speaking with a sort of authority about it that seems weird, that I wouldn't even like, right? Like what, I don't really know. And it's the arrogance, like, right, you're elite, like you're not even, because I've written about this before, like unfortunately a lot of our like there's a lot of separation, forgive this transgression, there's a lot of separation about the economy, and I've seen Nichols and others, Never Trumpers do this, and trans issues and queer issues in general, because the people who are allowed to have the debate who are queer is Sarah Longwell and Tim Miller, not the fact that, like, if you look at the numbers, like, no, when the economy's hurting, I think trans people are in a lot of, like, those are the folks who have trouble finding jobs. If you can't, like, Rahm Emanuel talking about, why were you talking about bathrooms? Well, because if you can't use the bathroom in public, it's hard to, especially if you're on a factory floor. I mean, Sarah McBride has her own private bathroom in Congress. That's a privilege she can like, that's going to be different if you're at Starbucks, right? And trying to like live a life and do a job. And I think, the people, Democrats need to hear more from those folks who are just trying to live their life. We're not hearing from those voices. I don't know if Hassan Piker could do it. I'm just saying we need to hear more from people who are just, should be our voters or whatever. And it's not necessarily what the Bulwark is going to do. I'd also add, regarding Longwell, two things that stand out to me. A friend of mine, not particularly as political, I mean, very few people are as politically, I do this for a living, but like, he kind of reads her stuff, listens to her stuff, not knowing her background, right? Like that she used Republican or whatever. And I remember you asking me, it's because he's like she seems reasonable, and he would be like, wow, she's like, why does she hate this Mandami guy? Like, why is she so upset about this pipe? Like, he doesn't, he's someone who's not particularly, he's not going to connect the dots necessarily to the, not in a, he's an idiot, but he's just almost, there's a kind of innocence there of like, I don't understand why, what's the deal? Like, because he just seems Mandami, this is a nice guy. It's like, why do you suddenly hate this guy? And everything is, why is Shapiro like this perfect politician? There are, like, she'd done this again today of like, that's the silver bullet is Slotkin and Shapiro, because they can thread the needle between they're both Jewish, but they can kind of criticize Israel, but there's no data behind that, right? I mean, she presents stuff as having data, but it was like, well, there's a lot of issues with Shapiro, like in his background.
The view.
Yeah, like in there's past in his past history, and those are things, but they're not really interrogating that. And again, my friend had pointed out as well, like, oh well, Tim Waltz seems fine, but she was very angry that
Right.
that Kamala Harris chose Waltz, which was also interesting because it was too there was a debate. She just thought he was like not centrist enough. He was not Josh Shapiro. Shapiro was her guy from the start. But then Tim Miller was like, Waltz seems fine, but then he was worried that Harris had chosen Waltz because Waltz appealed more to liberals than Shapiro. And then he was worried that she was listening too much to the left,
Yeah.
but that you that's what politicians do. They listen to their base. This is the same election where Trump chose JD Vance. So it's a very interesting, that sort of bias that they are presenting, and we kind of talk about bias, right? They have a bias that is not always necessarily interrogated into how they present news, how to present data. Longwell, who's the publisher, it's very dangerous because she presents a lot of stuff through sort of a focus group lens. And I'm not crazy about focus, just believe in something and or talk to people, right? Just talk. I'm happy with talking to people, but I think when it's through a focus group, it's sort of like I kind of know where I want to get to. And I'm
100%.
kind of, so
Yeah.
everything is presented as like, oh, here's what my focus group said. Here's what my
This is
focus
what the voters think, not me.
exactly. And that allows her to sort of give that appeal to authority that she can kind of run on, and then it leads to just catastrophic choices like Harris campaigning in swing states with Liz Cheney.
Right.
Can I ask you guys about what you guys thought about that? Because that's been a big debate that goes on and on about because obviously that was Sarah Longwell was there, Charlie Sykes was there. Like, what do you guys think of that?
Still?
Yeah, I everything you're saying, and my spidey senses kind of like tingled on a lot of different things you were just saying. And one of them is about how first the Tim Miller and Sarah Longwell are kind of like second generation conservative messaging machine. So you have Bill Kristol there, who is like one of the architects of the conservative messaging engine. And then you have Sarah Longwell and Tim Miller, who grew up in the 80s, early 90s, and kind of took in the idea that being a Republican was also being an unabashed fan of the red, white, and blue. And that being a Democrat meant that you were like the sons or daughters of like hippies from the 60s who like have to deal with America but don't really like America. And so, that is just not true at all. But that is the narrative power of what the Roger Ailes, Rupert Murdoch, Jesse Helms, or I might now have said, but the Republican strategists of the late 20th century who created the Republican Party to be the pro-America party and the Democratic Party to be the anti-American party. And by doing that, they were able to move the country to a center-right position, even though there were a lot of center-left policies that Americans enjoyed, like Social Security, like public funding for roads and schools and other public goods. And so I think Sarah Longwell and Tim Miller come out of that world. And so when they're trying to help Democrats create political strategy for today, that world also means infantilizing your voters, putting your voters into a caricature when you're not inside the DC Beltway. So looking at the West Virginia as the, moonshining hillbilly, or the Texan as the, longhorn riding, loud person, or the California as the Birkenstocks wearing, juicer, so it's like they have these archetypes for different Americans all over the country. And that informs how they think that people in the political world should talk to these people. And for like Bulwark types, they are probably still infantilizing the voters in the way that they did when they were Republicans. And that goes into what you're saying about the focus groups, where everything hinges on what Bernice from Minnesota says, or, Shirley from Wyoming says. And let's be honest, they're lovely people in their own communities and their own rights, but they're also regurgitating Fox News talking points. And we have entire think tanks, one that I used to work for that I think does great work, Media Matters, who literally work to debunk the Trump to Fox pipeline, or the Republican messaging to Fox News to Rush Limbaugh, or Rush Limbaugh's heirs pipeline. So we're not really learning anything new by listening to those focus groups, but because she holds those opinions so highly is a symptom of the messaging and political world she was raised in, which is to infantilize and put caricatures around voters. And that translates also to the left. So you see it with her debate with Hassan Piker, or really non-debate, Hassan Piker just kind of exposing her through his feed, and now everybody is on Longwell watch to see what she says next. Or you basically have, the way she treated Zoran Mandani, where she didn't really go into the substance of what he was talking about, or really she didn't go into the history of Arab and Muslim relations in the Middle East. She just held on to the global antifada phrase and then just repeated that over and over again and tried to put so much juice into it without really having a good faith intellectual interrogation that one could in good faith disagree or agree with the way he said that, but it didn't serve her audience. It didn't help anybody grow intellectually. It just created more caricatures around Americans. And the last thing I'll say about that is that what a lot of readers and audiences are pointing to now is that those caricatures that the Bulwark's political strategy lives within is inherently harmful to people of color, because it shows that you can be a progressive or a white progressive person and have a very strident and morally strong argument that might come out a little crude or uncivil, but she might just look at it as, oh, that's a loud progressive. But then you do that with someone of color, like a man of color or a woman of color, and all of a sudden that person is unelectable, or she just doesn't like them viscerally at the bottom, for some visceral reason she doesn't like them. And so there's a little bit of a racialized context there. And again, we're all human. Everyone has ways of improving and learning. But when you come from a world of politics that is, as I said to Evan one time in one of our text exchanges, a very McDonald's style world of politics where everything is like cookie cutter and put through a machine and comes out the same way. And that's how the political talking points world of the cable news 90s and 2000s worked. And now we're in a world that you can literally watch someone form their ideas for 24 hours or for 8 hours a day on a streaming service. And even though they will have slip ups and sometimes it comes off as not clean cut, like a talking point session does in a think tank, it's more authentic to the audience and doesn't seem as cooked up in a laboratory. And I think what we're seeing with the Bulwark, with Sarah Longwell, with a lot of the people there compared to the new communications world that's emerging in the political digest or in the political zeitgeist, is that people are looking for authenticity and not just a DC laboratory that's cooking out caricatures and talking points of people.
Well, and I would just add to that there's a cynical view that, particularly with Longwell and other Trumpers, had to hammer the sort of anti-Semitism charge against Mandami and against others. I think it's been more weaponized because that allows it to be a more straightforward moral rejection, particularly in the New York mayor's race. Because if you're a never Trump, the idea was that your whole value proposition then was, okay, even if Trump is more likely aligned with my views, he is morally unfit. So I'm going to back, Hillary Clinton and then later Kamala Harris, because even though we disagree on everything policy-wise, they are more morally fit to run. In that election, that was the clear choice. Mandami versus someone like Cuomo.
Yes.
Given the history of, I'd had Lindsay Bolin on my show. I had the honor of having her on the show to talk to her about of what he had done, what he had continued to do. And of course, outright corruption. I mean, we forgot about with COVID, right? Like Just
Oh, yeah.
so both completely unfit. The worst you could say about Mandami, doesn't have a lot of. I'd like someone with more experience. I'm not crazy about some of his policies. Like we can debate as liberals about the efficacy of rent freeze and free. Those are debates. But again, from a never Trump perspective, their whole thing of country over party and all of that, it's a no brainer. It's not. It's not. De Blasio and Mandami, or even Lander and Mandami. I mean, or any others who'd ran. If it was Cuomo and Mandami, come on. And so I felt that there had to be a sense, and we just saw a lot of people, from, who had been vocal anti-Trump. So Amy Schumer, Deborah Messing, among the policy, who were just, well, I have to do Cuomo. And I feel like when people, especially liberals, are even more dangerous in this way, this is my crazy theory, forgive me, they're even more dangerous in this way than conservatives because they have an identity around, obviously I can't support a rapist and I'm not proud to support a rapist, right? I'm not proud to support a sexual pest. I'm not proud to support a bit, so this other person must be especially terrible to just I'm angry that I have to do this because it's sort of attacking my identity of self. So I have to envision a version of Mandami that is a threat to Jewish people everywhere, that is a radical beyond who he actually is, to justify my siding with Cuomo, when in fact it could just be more, frankly, it'd be morally more authentic to just be like, no, I don't want to pay more in taxes or something.
Right. It's very much economic interest that people cannot express in good company. And so they have to look, Stephen, I don't think that's a crazy idea. I think it's built atop the argument that MLK laid out in his letter from Birmingham jail. I think it's very much, in line with that analysis of the white moderate, right? And so I think that has a historical backing, and I think it's absolutely accurate. I really appreciate what has happened over the last few weeks with the Bulwark, and I want to thank Sarah Longwell for torpedoing her own credibility, because in doubling, tripling down, putting everything on the line, willing truly to die on the hill of a litmus test that nobody really buys, the Bulwark has laid down a new litmus test that they themselves are not able to pass.
As former Trumpers, right? If you just look at what some of these folks have said in the past.
Exactly. We got to a situation in 2024 where Sarah Longwell was on stage with Liz Cheney, and people, I think, rightly illustrate that did not help her on the optics, but where Sarah Longwell has also been put on blast over the last couple of weeks and has lashed out in reaction to that, is that it reflects a deeper ideological and political strategy that the Kamala campaign took on, that the Bulwark was able to influence the Harris campaign's approach to policy and messaging. And that's the deeper indictment of the Bulwark and their influence, and their credibility was what allowed them to convince the Harris campaign to neuter Walz and to mute him on some of the messaging he was doing that was more effective. To stop talking about price gouging, which was actually really effective. And so as we look ahead to 2028, the best thing the Bulwark can do is continue to sabotage their own credibility, not just so that they're not on campaign stops with whoever the Democratic nominee ends up to be, but so their very ideology and worldview has a lot less purchase during primary season and when the general election is ran, that they have been granted a great deal of credibility by the Democratic establishment, by the elites, by the people who are aligned with their worldview. I think we all appreciate that they don't deserve that credibility. And what Sarah Longwell has done by leading into this fight is inviting the entire world to interrogate the credibility that the Bulwark has. And the verdict seems to be coming in pretty clearly. You guys don't have it.
Exactly. And hi, my conversation with Stuart and Evan has been going so well. I decided to make it 2 parts. This is the end of part 1. Please tune in next time for part 2. Thanks.